So before we move on to the actual determinants of supply, or our ceteris paribus, in other words, it's Latin for all else equal, that list of determinants of supply, I want us to dig in a little bit more and get more specific, because this is an area where many students struggle to go from the conceptual understanding of marginal cost to the actual deep level understanding. So let's assume you have a plot of land. You're growing, and that land can either grow rice or beans. There's only two things. Now, obviously, this is unrealistic. The whole point of doing this, though, is that we actually makes life a lot easier if we make some of these assumptions. So you can grow either rice or beans, and you can grow them. These are the combinations. You can either grow a bushel of, right? You can either grow 14 bushels of rice and no beans at all. You can grow, you can grow 10 bushels of beans and no rice at all, or a variety of combinations. Okay? So now the question is, let's look at your decision to grow beans. So obviously, and we're going to talk about the cost not in dollars at this point, but in rice, because when you grow beans, you give up rice. And that's simple, because we've assumed these are the only two things you can grow. So when you grow 0 beans, there's obviously no cost. You're not giving up any rice to grow beans when you're not growing any beans. However, the cost of growing the first bushel of beans, in that case, you're going from 14.5 bushels of rice to 13.5 bushels of rice, which means you've had a reduction in the amount of rice of 1 bushel. What's the total cost of growing 2 bushels of beans? Well, there you could be growing 14.5 bushels of rice. Instead, you're only growing 12.4, and so that is now a total cost of 2.1 bushels. Going from 2 bushels to 3 bushels of beans, well, the cost of growing 3 bushels of beans, you could be growing 14.5 bushels of rice. Instead, you're growing 11.2, and so the total cost is 3.3 bushels of rice. We keep doing this. Hopefully you, check my math here, make sure that this works out right. This is something it is important for you to know. So if this doesn't make sense to you, you should wind back and figure out what I'm doing. 9.1, 10.8, 12.6, and 14.5, right? So obviously, you can see if you get the same numbers as me. Basically, when you grow no rice and only beans, you are giving up 14.5 bushels of rice. Now, what's the marginal cost? In other words, what's the cost of each bushel here? Well, obviously, the cost of the 0th bushel doesn't even make sense. We can leave that blank. We could put 0 in there. We can put a dash in there. It doesn't actually make sense because we're not growing anything, so there's no marginal cost. It turns out what's the cost of the first bushel of beans? Well, to go from 0 to 1 bushels of beans, you are giving up 1 bushel of rice. You go from 14.5 to 13.5. What's the cost of growing not 2 bushels of beans, but the second bushel? Well, my total cost was 1 bushel of rice when I was growing 1 bushel of beans. Going from 1 to 2 then must be the change in the total cost. And change in total cost is our new total cost minus our old total cost. So that would be the cost that is attributable to the second bushel of beans. And so in this case, it would be 1.1. You are giving up an additional 1.1 bushels of rice in order to grow the second bushel of beans. So 2.1 is the cost of growing 2 bushels. 1.1 is the cost of growing the second bushel. How about the third bushel? 1.2. How do we know that? Because our total cost was 2.1 when we weren't growing the third bushel, and now it's 3.3, and the change is 1.2. If you do the math here, you'll see that I actually just set this up in Excel. There you go. So the marginal cost, or the cost of the 10th bushel of beans, is 1.9 here. So if we think about this, again, we're used to thinking in dollars, not bushels of rice. So this is the cost in bushels of rice. Well, let's see this. So what do we need to do in order to put this in dollars? Well, we need to know what you could get, what the value is of that rice that you're giving up. And so when the price of rice is $10 a bushel, this is obvious, right? Then what do? When you're giving up one bushel, you are giving up one bushel of rice, which is the equivalent of $10. When the second bushel here, $11, $12. You're giving up $12 to grow the third bushel of beans. You're giving up $13 in order to grow the fourth bushel of beans, and so on and so forth. Okay. So what is all of this in ADA? Well, it lets us figure out what we have to compensate the farmer, or you, if you want to think about it that way, in order to get you to grow the first bushel. Well, if the price of beans per bushel is $7, you're not going to grow any beans. You're going to grow just rice. Why? Because the benefit is the price you're going to get from the beans. And if you can only get $7 a bushel, it costs you more to grow the bushel than the benefit that you're getting. That would be a stupid thing to do. How much are we going to have to? So if the price was $10.50, how many bushels would you grow? Hopefully, you'll say, well, I would only grow one bushel of beans, and the rest you would grow rice. Why? Because at $10.50, that first bushel is the only, you're happy to do it, right? $10.50, happy to do it. You're getting 50 cents more than you could be getting growing rice, and that's the only other thing you could be doing, so you would do it. How much would we have to pay you to get you to grow the fourth bushel of beans? It would have to be at least $13. If we offered you less than $13, you'd say, nope, right? And so you wouldn't bother. If it was, say we offered to pay you $12.50, you would grow 3 bushels of beans and 11.2 bushels of rice. Okay? So what this now means is, so this tells us here, oh wait, I'm just going to erase this over here. So we've got this in dollars now. Make myself some. So hopefully you understand. First thing is you understand how to get to marginal benefit and marginal cost, right? So you can attribute, and this is different than average, by the way. Average cost would be total cost divided by quantity. Marginal cost would be the change in total cost as a result of producing that unit, which would be the same thing as the total cost when you produce that specific unit minus the total cost when you don't produce that unit. And that's how we get marginal cost. Okay. Well, now let's go back to this. Let's go back here, and now let's put the benefit of beans. So this is maybe the price of beans, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, let's do this a little smaller. We'll actually just start here at 10, 11, 12, 13. Okay? And I'll try and do fairly appropriate scaling here. Okay. So to get you to grow or not just grow, but also then produce and bring to market that first bushel, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we're going to have to pay you at least $10. So at a price of $10, you say, yeah, I'll produce a bushel of beans. Will you produce the second bushel? No, it's not worth it. You're going to keep growing rice. In order to get you to produce the second bushel of beans, we're going to have to pay you at least $11. Now, right, I hear you saying probably, or if you're anything like my other students across the years, but wait, you'd have to get at least something more than $11. Sure, 11 plus epsilon, plus a small amount. If you were already growing this, you wouldn't, right? If you were growing this mixture, you wouldn't change, so fine. How about the third bushel? Okay, the fourth bushel, and so on and so forth. So, turns out we can get all combinations of benefit and quantity here. This is the benefit that the supplier receives. And we can connect those dots and we get a schedule, our supply schedule. Now, it doesn't have to be straight. It just has to be sloping up and to the right. So it turns out that we have our concept of supply, our law of supply. We now have our picture of supply. And it turns out that what we've diagrammed, what we've graphed in order to get this schedule is the marginal cost, the cost to the producer of each unit. So what does this mean? Well, if we look at it, if we wanted to say, what's the total cost of 4 bushels, what would that be? It's going to be, that's the cost of that one, cost, right? And what's the total benefit? Well, you're getting, if you're producing 4 bushels, you must be getting $13 a bushel, so you're getting benefit, 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 benefit. Now, I'll clean this up in just a moment and go back over that. But this is analogous to a demand schedule. Demand schedule tells us the marginal benefit to the consumers. A supply schedule tells us the marginal cost to the producers. Now, what changes our supply schedule here? Well, one thing here is what we could call cost of inputs. In other words, let's think about what happens to our supply schedule when instead of the price of rice being $10, it's $20. Well, now, instead of this being 10, so this was when price of rice was 10, and here it's 20. So this would be 20, 22, oh, no, yep, 22, 24, 26, 28, 30, 32, 34, right? And so forth. Well, what does that do now? Well, now we have a whole new schedule. In order to get you to grow that first bushel now, we would have to, oh, I made this, well, instead of this being 20, why don't I do, it'll be a little bit harder to do the math, but let's do $11. So here we'd have $11.10, right? So basically what's going to happen is this dot moves up, this dot moves up, we connect our dots, we have a new supply schedule. Now you'll notice that this was nothing happened with expenses. You didn't have to pay anything more for the land. It was that the value you could be getting with the land has gone up for an alternative activity. So again, just like with demand, you can think about these dots moving in and out or up and down. So if we think about, let me just clean this up. So we have our determinants of supply, we have cost of inputs, and that can be a whole host of things. And so if it costs, you can either think about, right, this is the cost of that unit there. If you're giving up more to produce that unit, you're going to demand that people give you more. If this is the cost, right, you demand that people give you more, else you, oops, sorry, what am I doing? I've labeled that quantity. Terrible. There we go, right? On the other hand, if the value of the alternative uses of the time, energy, and resources that go into producing something, if those decrease in value, then I think about that dot moving down. We have to give you less to produce that unit and less to produce that unit. Okay? All right. Next, cost of inputs, technology. In other words, if you discover a new farming practice that lets you double the amount of beans you get for the land used, then what happens? you will now, at all benefits, before you were producing this much, now you would produce out here. Before you were producing this much, now you'd produce out here. We'd have a new supply schedule. Technology, if technology tends to shift supply schedules to the right, but if you have something where we forget a bunch of stuff or people get killed, we have a war with scientists and factories getting destroyed, then it could plausibly move the other direction, but generally technology is going to move it out and to the right. And then finally, this is nice, there's only 3 of them. The thing is, this is a really big piece. There's a whole bunch of pieces that can slot in there. We have our good friends in expectations and information. Now, this was under demand as well. And what I encourage you to, the way to think about it was expectations and information about the benefit. That's what affects consumers. That's what affects the demand schedule. Here, since supply is a cost schedule, a marginal cost schedule, the information that must be relevant is information about cost to the supplier, not cost to the consumer, not benefit to the consumer. Remember, individuals choose according to their expected marginal benefit and their expected marginal cost. And so here, what this third piece is the expectations and information about the cost to the suppliers. Now, let's go back over this. So the short list, just 3 things. Now, let's see if we can again go back over this. I'm just going to put some pieces in here, and this is just going to be a slightly different way of looking at this. So, what are suppliers weighing? They are weighing their cost and their benefit. So, what can we say about their cost and benefit? Well, what's the cost of the first unit? Well, we know that it has to be less than or equal to 1. How do we know that? Well, at 1, at a price of 1 or a benefit of 1, what happens? Well, producers bring this to market. So they engage in the behavior, which means the benefit must be greater than the cost. How about the cost of the second unit? Well, we know it has to be greater than 1. Why? Because at a benefit of 1, this person said, no, thank you. I'm not going to produce that unit. And we know that it has to be less than or equal to 2. Why? Because again, people are weighing the cost and the benefit. At a benefit of 2, they say, I'll do it. I'll engage in the behavior, which means the benefit must be greater than the cost. Cost of the third has to be greater than 2 and less than 3. Again, we don't have to know anything about this market or what people are doing with this or what their costs are. We can just observe their behavior and thereby figure out what their costs are. So supply is a marginal cost schedule. Now, if we wanted to think about what's the total cost of 3 units, well, we know this is the cost of the first, and that's the cost of the second, and that's the cost of the third. Doesn't look right, but maybe this will be, and again, we could have some triangles in here, but the thing to, again, think about, 3 million here. What's going to happen? We have cost, 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 cost. That whole area right there. And again, we could break out calculus and feel fancy and dominate people and make it look like we know all this important things that other people will never understand, but that's probably not really a productive use of our time. Now, let's just pick see if we understand this. When suppliers supplied this quantity right here, I'm going to put some letters in here. A, B, C, and D. What's their total benefit? What's their total cost? I'll give you a moment. Maybe, you can, I don't have to give you a moment. You can pause this. Forget about this. So you can pause this, but hopefully you come up with an answer here. Because again, we want to know total benefit and total cost. Not the number of values, but this will allow us in short order to actually start assessing policies and some other things like that. So hopefully you've said the total cost must be, if we add up all the individual costs, and this is the way, rather than memorizing areas, cost, the cost of each unit, that's D. The benefit must be, per unit, must be this much. Because people are producing this much, and we're assuming, by the way, that all goods are sold at the same price. It's what's called the law of one price. Maybe we'll have time, I don't think so, but maybe I will take the opportunity to talk about situations when the price isn't the same for all units, but generally speaking, goods tend to sell for the same price, whether it's the first unit or the 6th unit. So if producers are producing this many units, what must be true? Well, this must be the benefit. So they're getting the benefit of that unit plus benefit plus benefit plus benefit. They're getting C and D. And so what is their net benefit? Well, it's the same thing it was for consumers in that it is total benefit minus total cost. This, by the way, is what we're going to call producer surplus, which is just the net benefit to the producers. And that would be C and D minus D, which is C. Now, again, what we're going to see by the end of the term is we're going to have this chopped up into a whole bunch of other spaces, and people start yelling at me and saying, oh, that's atrocious and terrible. It doesn't, if you understand the underlying pieces here, if you understand what I talked about in this video and some other, the earlier videos on demand, then we can chop this up into a whole bunch of different pieces. And the only thing that changes is the number of letters you have to write down. And you might make a copying mistake and your wrist might get sore, but there's not going to be a lot of deep thought if you understand what's going on. So do yourself a favor, lay in the foundations. If these videos made no sense at all, try going back and watching them a second time or third time. If that doesn't, take a look at the textbook. And then reach out and we can see if you need some help.